I was standing in my driveway at 6 in the morning, staring at an empty patch of snow-covered concrete where my F-250 had been parked just hours earlier, and my first thought was that someone had stolen it during the blizzard. The February wind cut through my jacket as I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of my truck. But all I saw were the pristine white mounds that had buried our neighborhood overnight. Springfield, Massachusetts had been hammered with nearly 2 feet of snow, and the emergency declaration I had signed as mayor just 12 hours ago was still in effect. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another crisis, probably. Being mayor of a city with over 150,000 residents meant the emergencies never stopped, especially during weather events like this. But I ignored it for the moment, too focused on the mystery of my missing vehicle. I walked to the street, my boots crunching through the fresh powder, looking for tire tracks or any indication of where my truck had gone. That is when I noticed the barely visible tread marks leading away from my driveway, already filling in with fresh snowfall from the continuing storm. My name is Gregory Hamilton, and I had been mayor for 3 years. I lived in a modest colonial house in the 16 Acres neighborhood, a middle-class area that had recently been developed with a homeowners association. When I bought the house 4 years ago, the HOA seemed harmless enough. The dues were reasonable, and the covenants were standard. But over the past year, things had changed. A new board president had taken over, and suddenly the HOA had become increasingly aggressive about enforcement. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher, Marie, recognized my voice immediately. "Mayor Hamilton, what can I do for you?" "Marie, my truck is missing from my driveway. It looks like it might have been towed, but I cannot figure out why. Can you check if there were any reports of towing in the 16 Acres area overnight?" There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Let me see what I have here. Yes, sir. There were multiple towing reports from your neighborhood. Looks like they were called in by someone named Patricia Morrison. She is listed as the president of the 16 Acres HOA, of course. Patricia." The woman had been a thorn in my side since she took over the HOA board. She was in her late 40s, had that distinctive haircut that screamed entitlement, and treated HOA regulations like they were constitutional law. She had sent me 3 violation notices in the past 6 months alone, citing everything from my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall to my garbage cans being visible from the street for more than 4 hours after collection. "Which tow company?" I asked. "Quick Response Towing. They are based out of the industrial park on Page Boulevard." I knew the company. They had a reputation for being aggressive, and there had been numerous complaints filed with the city about their practices. In fact, I had a folder on my desk at City Hall specifically about quick response towing, filled with grievances from citizens about predatory towing, excessive fees, and damaged vehicles. "Thanks, Marie. Can you patch me through to them?" "Sure thing, Mayor." The line clicked and rang. A gruff voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Quick Response Towing. This is Gregory Hamilton. You towed my truck from my residence overnight. I need to know on what authority and where I can retrieve it. Name on the ticket." The man sounded bored. "Hamilton. Gregory Hamilton. The address is 47 Woodbridge Lane." More typing. "Yeah, got it here. Towed at 02:30 hours. Violation of HOA parking restrictions during snow emergency. Truck is here at our lot. Retrieval fee is $450 plus a $100 daily storage fee." $450. For what? Emergency towing, after hours fee, snow removal surcharge. You want your truck, that is the price. I felt my jaw clench. "I will be there within the hour, cash only." He hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my driveway, snow accumulating on my shoulders, and felt the anger building in my chest, not just because my truck had been towed, but because of the absolute audacity of it. We were in the middle of a declared snow emergency. I had specifically ordered all non-essential vehicles off the streets to allow for plowing, but there had been no mention of private driveways. And even if there had been, my truck was a city vehicle. I used it for emergency response during situations exactly like this. I went back inside where my wife was making coffee in the kitchen. She looked up as I entered, snow melting off my jacket onto the floor. "Where is the truck?" she asked. Patricia had it towed. My wife, whose name was Sarah, set down her coffee mug with more force than necessary. "You are joking." "I wish I was. Quick Response Towing has it. They want $450. That woman is insane. Does she not know you are the mayor?" I do not think Patricia cares. She has been on this power trip ever since she took over the HOA. She probably saw the snow emergency as an opportunity to flex. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at our quiet street. "Half the driveways on this street still have cars in them. Why single out yours?" That was a good question. I pulled out my phone and called my deputy mayor, Richard Chen. He answered immediately. "Greg, I was just about to call you. We have got a situation at the Emergency Operations Center." "What kind of situation?" "The National Guard is requesting additional support for evacuation of the nursing home on Roosevelt Avenue. The generator failed and they have got 60 residents who need to be moved." "I will be there as soon as I can. I've got a personal situation I need to handle first." I explained what had happened. Richard was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said slowly, "this might actually be a blessing in disguise." "How so?" "We have been looking for a reason to take action against Quick Response Towing. The complaints have been piling up. If they are using a city-declared emergency to engage in predatory towing practices, that is a violation of the emergency ordinance. You could pull their operating license." He was right. Under the emergency declaration, price gouging and predatory business practices were explicitly prohibited. And if Quick Response Towing was working with the HOA to target residents during an emergency, that opened up a whole can of legal worms. "Let me go down there and see what is happening firsthand," I said. "Document everything. Then we will move forward. Be careful. You know these tow companies can be shady." I changed into warmer clothes, grabbed my city identification, and called a ride share. The roads were barely passable, but eventually a driver accepted the request. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside Quick Response Towing's chain link compound on Page Boulevard. The lot was packed with vehicles, at least 30 of them, all covered in snow. I recognized several from my neighborhood. The office was a dingy trailer with bars on the windows. A handwritten sign on the door said, "Cash only," in aggressive red letters. I pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke despite the state's indoor smoking ban. A man in his 50s sat behind a desk, his belly straining against a grease-stained shirt. He looked up at me with dead eyes. "Help you? I am here to retrieve my truck, F-250, towed from Woodbridge Lane." He did not even check the computer. "450 plus the 100 for storage, 550 total. You said 450 on the phone less than an hour ago. Day starts at 6 a.m. It is now 7:15. That is storage." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm and professional. "I am going to need an itemized receipt showing how you arrived at these charges." The man stared at me. "You want your truck or not? I want documentation of these charges." Under Massachusetts law, you are required to provide an itemized breakdown of all towing fees. "Look, buddy, I do not know who you think you are, but I am Gregory Hamilton, mayor of Springfield. And I am asking you, as a private citizen whose vehicle was towed under questionable circumstances, to provide the legally required documentation." The man's expression shifted slightly. Not quite fear, but recognition that this was not a typical customer. He pulled out a greasy keyboard and typed slowly, then printed out a form on an ancient dot matrix printer. He shoved it across the desk. I picked it up and read through it. The charges were even more egregious than I had thought. There was a hazardous weather fee of $75, a priority towing fee of $100, an after-hours dispatch fee of $150, and multiple other nickel and dime charges that added up to highway robbery. "This is price gouging," I said. "That is the fee. You do not like it, file a complaint." "Oh, I will. But first, I am going to need to see your city business license and your towing permit. They are posted." "I do not see them." The man stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You calling me a liar?" "I am asking to see your permits, which Massachusetts General Law Chapter 266, Section 120D requires to be displayed prominently in any towing business." We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, he stomped over to a wall covered in faded posters and ripped down a plastic sleeve containing several official-looking documents. He thrust them at me. I examined them carefully. The city business license was current, but the towing permit was interesting. It had been issued 3 years ago and required renewal annually. The expiration date was February 1st. Today was February 14th. "This permit is expired," I said. "Renewal is pending." "Do you have documentation of the pending renewal?" "It is in process." "So you have been operating for the past 2 weeks without a valid towing permit, and you have been charging customers, including myself, fees for services rendered without proper licensing." The man's face was turning red. "You need to leave." "I need my truck." "And now that I know you are operating without a valid permit, I cannot in good conscience pay these fees. You are engaged in unlicensed commercial activity, which under city ordinance means any contracts or fees are voidable. I am calling the cops. Please do. I would love to have them here to witness this." He grabbed his phone, but before he could dial, the door to the trailer opened. A woman walked in and I recognized her immediately. Patricia Morrison, the HOA president. She was wearing a puffy white coat that made her look like the Michelin Man, and her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the blizzard. When she saw me, her expression hardened. "Mayor Hamilton, what are you doing here?" "Retrieving my truck that was illegally towed from my private driveway." "It was not illegal. It was in violation of HOA parking restrictions during the snow emergency." "There are no HOA parking restrictions that cover private driveways during snow emergencies. I have read the covenants." Patricia pulled out her phone and opened an email. "Emergency addendum to the parking policy, enacted last night at 7 p.m. All vehicles must be garaged during snow emergencies to ensure maximum clearance for emergency vehicles. You cannot unilaterally enact policy changes. The HOA bylaws require a board vote and 30 days notice to residents. The board voted unanimously. At 7 p.m. on a Sunday night during a blizzard, and somehow you managed to get the vote done, notify residents and arrange for towing all within hours. I find that hard to believe, Patricia." Her face flushed. "The safety of our community is paramount. We acted in accordance with our authority." "No, you acted in accordance with your grudge against me. This is retaliation, and we both know it." The tow truck operator was watching this exchange with growing concern. He clearly had not expected this level of drama when he agreed to work with the HOA. Patricia stepped closer to me. "You think you can do whatever you want because you are the mayor." The HOA has authority over this neighborhood, and you are subject to the same rules as everyone else. I do not think I am above the rules, but I also know the difference between legitimate enforcement and harassment. You have sent me more violation notices in the past 6 months than any other resident in this neighborhood. You have targeted my property repeatedly. And now, you have had my truck towed during an emergency when I needed to do my job serving this city. Your political position does not exempt you from HOA regulations. And your position as HOA president does not give you the right to abuse your authority. We were standing nearly toe to toe now. The tow truck operator cleared his throat. Look, I do not want to be in the middle of this. Just pay the fee and take your truck. I turned to him. I am not paying $550 in illegal fees to an unlicensed towing operation that is engaged in predatory practices during a declared emergency. Then your truck stays here. That is theft. That is the law. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, let me clarify what the law actually says. I dialed City Hall and asked to be transferred to the city solicitor's office. Janet Reeves, our head attorney, picked up on the second ring. Janet, it is Greg. I need you to listen carefully and give me your legal opinion on something. I explained the situation in detail, including the expired towing permit, the questionable HOA policy change, and the excessive fees. Patricia and the tow operator listened, their expressions growing increasingly uncomfortable. Janet's response was clear and unequivocal. The towing is legally questionable at best. The permit issue alone invalidates their authority to operate. And if they are refusing to release the vehicle, that is conversion, which is a criminal offense. You have grounds to demand immediate release of the vehicle and to pursue both civil and criminal charges. I put the phone on speaker. Janet, can you repeat that for everyone here? She did, her voice crisp and professional. When she finished, I thanked her and hung up. So here is what is going to happen, I said. You are going to release my truck immediately at no charge. In exchange, I will not file criminal charges for conversion and operating without a license. However, I will be conducting a full investigation into quick response towing's practices, and I will be reviewing all complaints filed against you. If I find evidence of systematic predatory behavior, your business license will be revoked entirely. The operator looked like he wanted to argue, but the legal reality was clear. He grabbed a set of keys from a hook on the wall. Bay 7, he muttered. Patricia stepped in front of me. This is not over. You are right, it is not. Because I am also going to be investigating the HOA's finances and operations. If you have been colluding with this tow company to generate revenue through predatory towing, that is a serious legal issue. HOAs are required to act in the best interest of residents, not to profit from their harassment. You are abusing your position as mayor to threaten me. I am using my position as mayor to protect citizens from abuse. There is a difference. I walked out of the trailer and followed the operator to where my truck was parked. He used a forklift to move 2 other vehicles out of the way, then handed me the keys without a word. I inspected the truck carefully. There was a fresh dent in the rear bumper and a scratch along the driver's side door. You damaged my vehicle, I said. It was like that. No, it was not. I want photos and documentation of this damage. Take it up with your insurance. I took several photos with my phone, including close-ups of the damage and wide shots showing the truck's location in the lot. Then I climbed into the cab and started the engine. It roared to life, and I backed carefully out of the tight space. As I drove out of the lot, I saw Patricia standing by her car, watching me with an expression of pure fury. I did not acknowledge her. I had more important things to deal with. The nursing home evacuation took the rest of the morning. By the time we had all 60 residents safely relocated to temporary housing, it was nearly noon. The snow had finally stopped, and the plows were making progress on the main roads. I returned to City Hall and went straight to my office. My assistant, Michael, looked up as I entered. "You look exhausted. It has been a morning. Is Richard still here in his office?" I found Richard reviewing emergency response reports. He looked up when I knocked. "How did it go?" he asked. I told him everything, including the confrontation with Patricia and the expired towing permit. Richard listened carefully, making notes. "This is good," he said when I finished. "We have grounds for action. The question is, how hard do you want to go after them?" "I want quick response towing shut down. Their practices are predatory. They are operating without a valid permit, and they are taking advantage of emergency situations to gouge residents. I want their business license permanently revoked. That will require a hearing. We will need to document everything. Start pulling all the complaints we have on file. I want every grievance, every report, every piece of evidence of their misconduct. And I want an audit of their financial relationship with the 16 acres HOA. If Patricia has been receiving kickbacks from towing fees, that is fraud." Richard nodded. "I will get the legal team on it. What about the HOA itself?" "That is trickier. HOAs have a lot of autonomy under state law. But if they are engaging in selective enforcement or using their authority for personal vendettas, that is a breach of their fiduciary duty to residents. I want our housing department to investigate their practices. You know Patricia is going to claim this is retaliation. Let her. Everything we are doing is based on legitimate complaints and legal violations. I am not targeting her because she towed my truck. I am addressing systematic problems that have been reported by multiple residents. Over the next 3 days, my legal team worked around the clock to build a case. What they found was worse than I had expected. Quick response towing had been operating with an expired permit for nearly 6 months, not 2 weeks. The city's licensing department had sent multiple notices about the expiration, but the company had ignored them. In the past year alone, there had been 73 complaints filed against quick response towing, ranging from excessive fees to damaged vehicles to outright theft. More damning was the financial connection to the HOA. Records showed that Patricia had signed a contract with Quick Response Towing that gave the HOA a percentage of all towing fees from the neighborhood. Essentially, the HOA was profiting every time a resident's car was towed. This created a direct financial incentive for aggressive enforcement of parking rules, which explained why violation notices had skyrocketed since Patricia took over. On the 4th day after the incident, I called a press conference. The local media showed up in force. Springfield had been dealing with the aftermath of the blizzard, and any news was getting heavy coverage. I stood at the podium in City Hall's main conference room, with Richard and Janet flanking me. Behind us was a display board showing photos and documents related to the case. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I am here today to announce that the City of Springfield is immediately revoking the business license of Quick Response Towing, effective immediately. This decision comes after an extensive investigation revealed that the company has been operating without a valid towing permit for nearly 6 months and has engaged in systematic predatory practices against Springfield residents." I went through the details methodically. The expired permit, the excessive fees, the complaints, the damaged vehicles. The reporters were taking notes furiously. "In addition," I continued, "we are referring this matter to the Attorney General's office for investigation into potential consumer protection violations and fraud." Quick response towing will not be allowed to operate in Springfield until they have addressed these issues and applied for a new permit through the proper channels. Given the severity of the violations, I will be recommending that any new permit application be denied. A reporter raised her hand. Mayor Hamilton, there are reports that your personal vehicle was towed by this company. Did that influence your decision to revoke their license? I had been expecting this question. My truck was indeed towed by Quick Response Towing during the recent snow emergency. However, my investigation into their practices began long before that incident. We have had complaints about this company for over a year. The towing of my vehicle simply highlighted the urgent need to address these problems. Every resident of Springfield deserves to be treated fairly and not subjected to predatory business practices. Another reporter spoke up. What about the HOA's involvement? We have heard that the 16 acres HOA has a financial arrangement with the tow company. That is correct. Our investigation revealed that the HOA has been receiving a percentage of towing fees, which creates a problematic financial incentive. We are referring that matter to the state's Office of the Attorney General for review. HOAs have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of their residents, and profiting from their enforcement actions raises serious questions about whether that duty is being met. The questions continued for another 20 minutes. When the press conference ended, I felt both exhausted and relieved. The story would be on the evening news, and by tomorrow morning, it would be in all the papers. I was right. The next day, the Springfield Republican ran a front-page story with the headline "Mayor Bans Predatory Tow Company After Personal Experience." The article was thorough and fair, laying out the facts without sensationalism. The online version was shared thousands of times on social media. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Residents who had been victimized by Quick Response Towing started coming forward with their own stories. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation, and the state's Department of Housing and Community Development announced that they would be reviewing the 16 acres HOA's practices. Patricia, meanwhile, had gone silent. She did not respond to media requests for comment. The HOA's website went dark. And when I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed that several houses had signs in their yards calling for new HOA leadership. 2 weeks after my press conference, I received a letter from Patricia's attorney. It was a notice that Patricia was resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. The letter claimed that she was stepping down for personal reasons, and made no mention of the investigation or the towing controversy. I suspected that her attorney had advised her that resignation was her best option to avoid further legal trouble. The HOA held an emergency election, and a new board was voted in. The new president, a retired teacher named Donald Foster, immediately rescinded the contract with Quick Response Towing and issued a formal apology to all residents who had been affected by the aggressive enforcement policies. Quick Response Towing tried to fight the license revocation. They hired an attorney and filed an appeal, arguing that the city had acted arbitrarily and that I had a personal vendetta against them. The hearing was held in late March, and I testified along with dozens of residents who had been victimized by the company's practices. The hearing officer, an independent attorney appointed by the state, listened to 2 full days of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Quick Response Towing had systematically violated city ordinances, state consumer protection laws, and basic standards of business ethics. Their attorney tried to argue that the violations were administrative oversights, but the pattern of behavior told a different story. The hearing officer ruled in the city's favor. The business license revocation was upheld, and quick response towing was ordered to pay restitution to affected customers. The total amount came to over $80,000. The company declared bankruptcy rather than pay, and their assets were liquidated to partially compensate victims. The Attorney General's investigation into the HOA took longer, but the results were equally satisfying. In late April, the AG's office announced that Patricia Morrison had been charged with multiple counts of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The charges stemmed from her financial arrangement with the towing company and evidence that she had used HOA funds for personal expenses. Patricia pleaded guilty to reduced charges in a deal that required her to pay full restitution to the HOA and perform community service. She avoided jail time, but her reputation was destroyed. She put her house up for sale and moved out of Springfield within weeks of the plea deal. For me, the whole experience was a reminder of why I had gotten into public service in the first place. It is easy to feel powerless when dealing with petty tyrants like Patricia or predatory businesses like quick response towing. But the truth is that we have laws and systems to protect people from abuse, and when those systems are used properly, they work. I also learned something about the nature of power. Patricia had thought that her position as HOA president gave her unchecked authority to enforce rules however she saw fit. She had forgotten that all legitimate power comes with responsibility and accountability. When she abused that power for personal reasons, the system corrected itself. The same was true for quick response towing. They had operated under the assumption that they could get away with predatory practices because their victims were individuals without the resources to fight back. But when those individual complaints were aggregated and investigated systematically, the pattern of abuse became undeniable. In the months that followed, Springfield implemented new regulations for towing companies. We required more stringent permit processes, regular audits, and a clearly posted schedule of maximum fees. We also created a hotline for residents to report predatory towing practices. Other cities in Massachusetts reached out to learn about our approach, and several adopted similar regulations. The 16 Acres HOA, under new leadership, became a model for responsible community governance. They revised their covenants to include more robust due process protections for residents and implemented term limits for board members to prevent the kind of entrenchment that had allowed Patricia to accumulate so much unchecked power. As for my truck, I got it fixed. The damage from the towing was covered by the restitution fund that was set up as part of the quick response towing bankruptcy proceedings. I also installed a security camera in my driveway, just in case. The whole experience became something of a local legend. People would occasionally bring it up at public events, usually with a smile. "You are the guy who banned the tow company," they would say. I always corrected them. I did not ban them because they towed my truck. I banned them because they were breaking the law and hurting people. But I understood why the story resonated. There is something satisfying about seeing someone abuse their power and then face consequences. It is a reminder that no one is above the law, whether they are running a business, leading an HOA, or serving as mayor. The spring turned to summer, and Springfield moved on to other challenges. We dealt with budget negotiations, infrastructure projects, and the usual political squabbles. The drama with Patricia and quick response towing faded into the background, just another chapter in the city's ongoing story. But every once in a while, when I was dealing with a particularly frustrating bureaucratic issue, or a case of institutional abuse, I would think back to that February morning when I stood in my driveway staring at the empty space where my truck should have been. I remembered the anger I felt, but also the determination. The system can work, but only if people are willing to use it and hold bad actors accountable. One evening in June, I was having dinner with Sarah at a local restaurant when I noticed Donald Foster, the new HOA president, at another table. He came over to say hello. "Mayor Hamilton, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. The neighborhood is so much better now." "I appreciate that, Donald. But really, the residents did the work. They came forward with complaints, they voted for change, and they held their leaders accountable. Still, it took courage to take on Patricia and that tow company. A lot of people would have just paid the fee and moved on. Maybe, but I do not think I could have lived with myself if I had. When you see injustice, you have to stand up to it. That is true whether you are a mayor or just a regular citizen." Donald nodded. "Well, the neighborhood appreciates it. We actually have money in our reserves again now that we are not paying off Patricia's pet projects." After he left, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "I am proud of you, you know." "For what?" "For not letting them get away with it. For using your position to help people instead of just shrugging it off. It was the right thing to do." "Yes, but a lot of people would not have done it. They would have been worried about the optics, or the political fallout, or getting accused of using their office for personal benefit." She was right. The political calculus could have gone very differently. If Patricia had been smarter about it, she could have spun the whole thing as a mayor abusing his power to settle a personal grudge. But the evidence had been so overwhelming and the pattern of abuse so clear that the narrative never gained traction. "I got lucky," I admitted. If Quick Response Towing had been operating legally, if Patricia had not been taking kickbacks, if there had not been dozens of other complaints on file, this could have ended very differently. But those things were true. You did not manufacture evidence. You just shined a light on what was already happening. That was the key, really. I had not gone after Patricia or the tow company because of a personal vendetta. I had simply followed the evidence wherever it led. The fact that it started with my truck being towed was almost incidental. The story did have some lasting political implications. In the next election cycle, I ran unopposed for re-election as mayor. My handling of the towing controversy had boosted my approval ratings significantly. People liked seeing a politician who was willing to take on powerful interests and follow through on promises of accountability. But more importantly, the case became a template for how to address similar issues. Other residents in other neighborhoods started pushing back against abusive HOAs. Towing companies across the state cleaned up their acts, knowing that predatory practices could lead to license revocation. And the Attorney General's office became more proactive about investigating HOA fraud. There was one final twist to the story that came in August. I was in my office reviewing budget documents when Michael knocked on the door. "There is someone here to see you. She says it is about the HOA case." "Who is it?" She would not give her name, just said it was important. I sighed. I still got occasional walk-ins related to the case, usually people with their own HOA complaints looking for help. "Send her in." The woman who entered was in her 30s, professionally dressed, with an air of nervous energy. She sat down across from my desk and pulled out a folder. "Mayor Hamilton, my name is Jennifer Pace. I am an investigative journalist with the Boston Globe. I have been working on a story about HOA fraud in Massachusetts, and your case with Patricia Morrison has been central to my research." I leaned back in my chair. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to give you a heads up. My story is running this Sunday, and it is going to make some waves. I have uncovered evidence that Patricia Morrison was not working alone." She was part of a network of HOA board members across the state who were coordinating with towing companies and kickback schemes. How many HOAs are we talking about? At least 15 that I have been able to document, maybe more. The scheme was sophisticated. They would share information about enforcement tactics, coordinate with the same group of towing companies, and funnel money through shell corporations to hide the kickbacks. I felt my stomach drop. That is organized fraud. Yes, and it has been going on for years. Your case broke it open because it was the first time someone with the resources and position to fight back actually did so. Once Patricia went down, others in the network started getting nervous. I have had several people reach out to me anonymously with information. Have you contacted the Attorney General? I am going to as soon as the story publishes. I wanted to give you advance notice because you are going to be mentioned prominently. You are essentially the catalyst for bringing this whole thing down. The story ran that Sunday, and it was even bigger than I had expected. The Globe's investigation revealed a sprawling network of HOA fraud that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from homeowners across Massachusetts. Patricia Morrison was named as one of the key players, but she was far from alone. The fallout was immediate and severe. The Attorney General launched a multi-county investigation. Several HOA board members were arrested. The towing companies involved lost their licenses and faced criminal charges. And the state legislature started drafting new laws to increase oversight of HOAs and prevent similar schemes. For Springfield specifically, the impact was mostly positive. We were seen as being ahead of the curve in addressing the problem. Other cities reached out to learn from our experience. And residents felt more confident that their local government would protect them from predatory practices. I did dozens of interviews in the weeks after the Globe story ran. Everyone wanted to know how I had uncovered the fraud and what advice I had for other communities dealing with similar issues. My answer was always the same. Pay attention to complaints, follow the evidence, and do not be afraid to hold powerful interests accountable. By the fall, the case had largely moved beyond my direct involvement. The criminal prosecutions were being handled by the Attorney General's office. The legislature was working on new regulations, and Springfield had moved on to other priorities. But I never forgot the lesson from that February morning when I found my driveway empty. Power, whether it is held by an HOA board president, a towing company, or a mayor, comes with responsibility. When that power is abused, it is everyone's obligation to speak up and demand accountability. Sometimes that is uncomfortable. Sometimes it is risky. But it is always necessary. The new year brought new challenges, as it always does in local government. We dealt with budget shortfalls, infrastructure failures, and the constant political maneuvering that comes with elected office. But whenever I felt frustrated or overwhelmed, I would drive through the 16 acres neighborhood and see families walking their dogs, kids playing in yards, and houses with lights on, and cars safely parked in driveways. That was what it was all about, really. Creating communities where people felt safe, where rules were applied fairly, and where no one could abuse their position without facing consequences. It was a simple idea, but one that required constant vigilance to maintain. Donald Foster remained HOA president and did an excellent job. He focused on actual community improvement rather than enforcement for its own sake. The neighborhood pool got renovated. The common areas were properly maintained, and residents actually looked forward to HOA meetings instead of dreading them. As for Patricia Morrison, I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to Florida and was keeping a low profile. She never apologized or acknowledged the harm she had caused, Some people are like that, I suppose. They are so invested in their own righteousness that they cannot see how their actions affect others. Quick response: towing never reopened. The owner tried to start a new company under a different name, but word got around and no one would use his services. He eventually left the state as well. The criminal cases against the HOA fraud network took over a year to work through the courts. In the end, 12 people were convicted on various charges. Sentences ranged from probation and restitution to actual prison time for the worst offenders. Patricia ended up serving 6 months in a minimum security facility, despite her plea deal, because the judge found that the scope of her fraud had been more extensive than originally disclosed. I followed those cases with interest, but I was not directly involved. My role had been to identify the problem and use the tools available to me as mayor to address it. The legal system took over from there and did its job. Looking back on the whole experience now, several years later, I am struck by how a single moment of frustration turned into a citywide reform effort that eventually exposed statewide corruption. If I had just paid the towing fee and moved on, none of that would have happened. Patricia would still be running her scheme. Quick response towing would still be gouging residents, and the larger fraud network would have continued operating unchecked, but I could not let it go. Not because I am particularly heroic or principled, but because I have always believed that doing the right thing matters. It is easy to become cynical in politics, to think that nothing really changes and that fighting the good fight is pointless. But this case proved otherwise. One person standing up to injustice can make a difference, but it is not just about the individual. It is about institutions and systems that support accountability. I had the resources of city government behind me. I had legal counsel who knew the law and how to apply it. I had a media that reported the facts fairly, and I had residents who were willing to come forward with their own experiences. That is how change happens. Not through individual heroism, but through collective action and functioning institutions. The whole experience also taught me something about the nature of petty tyranny. People like Patricia do not set out to be villains. They convince themselves that they are doing the right thing, that their strict enforcement of rules is for the greater good. They lose sight of the fact that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. When I first moved into the 16 acres neighborhood, I had no strong feelings about HOAs one way or the other. They seemed like a reasonable way to maintain property values and ensure basic standards. But Patricia's reign showed me how quickly that kind of structure can be corrupted when the wrong person is in charge. The key is balance. Communities need rules and standards, but they also need compassion, flexibility, and leaders who see their role as serving residents rather than controlling them. When those elements are in place, HOAs can be beneficial. When they are not, they become mechanisms of oppression. I have been asked many times if I regret buying a house in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. The answer is no. Despite everything that happened, I still live in the same house on Woodbridge Lane. The neighborhood is actually better now than it was before the whole controversy. People are more engaged, more aware of their rights, and more willing to hold their leaders accountable. That is what good governance looks like, whether it is at the neighborhood level or the city level. It is about creating systems where everyone has a voice, where rules are applied fairly, and where abuse of power is quickly identified and corrected. As mayor, I tried to embody those principles in everything I did. I did not always succeed. There were times when I made mistakes, when I let political considerations override what was right, when I failed to see a problem until it was too late. But the Patricia Morrison case reminded me why I got into public service in the first place. It is not about power or prestige. It is about making people's lives better, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that everyone gets a fair shake. Those are simple goals, but achieving them requires constant attention and effort. The last time I saw anything related to the old controversy was about 3 years after the initial incident. I was at a conference for mayors and city managers in Boston, and during a break, a woman approached me. "Excuse me, are you Gregory Hamilton from Springfield?" "I am." "I just wanted to shake your hand. I am from Worcester, and we had a similar situation with a predatory towing company. After reading about what you did in Springfield, we used the same approach. We documented complaints, investigated their practices, and revoked their license. It worked. So thank you for showing us how to fight back." We talked for a few minutes about the specifics of her case. It was eerily similar to what had happened in Springfield, right down to the HOA kickback scheme. But thanks to the template we had created and the legal precedents that had been established, Worcester was able to shut down the operation before it caused as much damage. That conversation made me realize that the impact of what we had done extended far beyond Springfield. By standing up to Patricia and quick response towing, we had created a roadmap that other communities could follow. We had shown that predatory practices could be defeated and that abusive HOAs could be reformed. In the grand scheme of things, it might seem like a small victory. We were not solving world hunger or curing disease. We were just dealing with a crooked HOA president and a shady towing company. But for the people who were directly affected, for the families who had been victimized and the residents who had been intimidated, it mattered enormously. That is what local government is all about. It is not about grand gestures or historic achievements. It is about solving problems that directly affect people's daily lives. It is about fixing the potholes, keeping the water running, making sure the garbage gets picked up, and yes, protecting residents from predatory businesses and abusive community associations. My term as mayor eventually came to an end. I served 3 terms total, 12 years of dealing with budgets and emergencies and political drama. When I finally stepped down, I was exhausted but satisfied. I had done good work. I had helped people, and I had left Springfield in better shape than I found it. The Patricia Morrison case remained one of the defining moments of my time in office. It was not the most important thing I did, policy-wise. We implemented major infrastructure improvements, reformed the police department, and restructured the city's finances. Those achievements had a bigger long-term impact on Springfield than banning one towing company. But the towing case was the one people remembered. It was the one that got repeated at dinner parties and mentioned in newspaper retrospectives. Because it was a story that everyone could understand and relate to. We have all dealt with petty tyrants who abuse their small amount of power. We have all felt the frustration of being treated unfairly by someone who thinks the rules do not apply to them. The difference is that most people do not have the resources or position to fight back effectively. I did, and I used those resources to not just solve my own problem, but to address a systematic issue that was affecting many people. That is what made the story resonate. As I write this, looking back on everything that happened, I am reminded that democracy is not just about big national elections and Supreme Court decisions. It is about local action and individual accountability. It is about standing up when you see something wrong and using whatever tools you have available to fix it. For me, those tools included my position as mayor and access to city legal resources. For someone else, it might be organizing neighbors, filing complaints with state regulators, or contacting the media. The specific tools matter less than the willingness to use them, Patricia Morrison thought she was untouchable. She thought her position as HOA president gave her unlimited power over her little fiefdom. She forgot that, in a functioning democracy, all power is ultimately accountable to the people. When she abused that power, the system corrected itself. It took time, effort, and determination, but justice prevailed. The same was true for quick response towing. They thought they could get away with predatory practices because their victims were individuals without resources. They did not count on those individual complaints adding up to a pattern that could not be ignored. They did not expect someone with the means to fight back to actually do so. In both cases, the lesson is the same. No one is above the law. No amount of power, whether it comes from running a business or presiding over an HOA, exempts you from basic standards of decency and legality. When those standards are violated, there must be consequences. That is not about revenge or vindictiveness. It is about maintaining a society where rules apply equally to everyone and where abuse of power has real costs. Without that accountability, the whole system breaks down. I am proud of what we accomplished in Springfield during my time as mayor. I am proud of the infrastructure we built, the services we improved, and the reforms we implemented. But I am especially proud of the fact that we stood up to bullies and protected people who could not protect themselves. That February morning when I found my truck missing, I had a choice. I could have paid the fee, gotten my truck back, and moved on with my life. No one would have blamed me. It would have been easier, faster, and would not have involved months of legal battles and political controversy. But I did not choose the easy path. I chose to fight back, not just for myself but for everyone else who had been victimized by the same predatory practices. That choice led to real change that made people's lives better. And that, in the end, is what public service is all about. The story could have ended differently. Patricia could have been more careful. Quick response towing could have been operating legally. The evidence could have been less clear. Any number of factors could have prevented the outcome we achieved, but they did not, and that is what matters. Sometimes standing up to injustice works. Sometimes the system functions as it should. Sometimes the good guys actually win. This was one of those times, and I am grateful to have been part of it. Years from now, when people talk about my time as mayor of Springfield, they will probably mention the Patricia Morrison case. They will tell the story of the mayor whose truck got towed during a snow emergency and who used that experience to take down a corrupt HOA president and a predatory towing company. It is a good story, and I am glad it has a happy ending, but the real story is not about me. It is about all the residents who came forward with complaints. It is about the legal team that built an airtight case. It is about the journalists who investigated and reported the facts. It is about the Attorney General's office that prosecuted the criminals. And it is about the voters who supported reform and demanded accountability. I was just one person in that chain. An important person, perhaps, because of my position, but still just one link. The real lesson of the story is that change requires collective action and functioning institutions. No one person can fix everything, but everyone can contribute to making things better. That is my hope for Springfield and for every community. That people will stay engaged, will demand accountability, will stand up to injustice when they see it. That institutions will function properly and support those efforts. And that power, wherever it exists, will be used responsibly and in the service of the common good. The Patricia Morrison case showed that those ideals are not just abstract principles. They are achievable goals that make a real difference in people's lives, and that is worth fighting for.